The untold story of the engineer who saved Apollo 11's landing. 30,000 feet above the surface of the moon, a computer screen lit up with a number that should not have been there. Two astronauts, seconds from making history, heard a warning alarm they had never once heard in training. Down in Houston, a room full of the best engineers on the planet had about 15 seconds to decide one thing: land or abort. What happened next was not luck. It was the result of a fight one woman had been having for years against people who told her, again and again, that she was worrying about nothing. You already know how the story usually ends. Neil Armstrong's boot touches gray dust. The Eagle has landed. Ticker tape, a flag, a plaque that says we came in peace for all mankind. That version of the story is true, but it leaves out the four most dangerous minutes of the entire mission. Minutes that almost nobody watching on television understood were dangerous at all. This is the story of those 4 minutes, and the engineer whose stubbornness made sure they ended the way they did. Her name was Margaret Hamilton, and before we go any further, let's clear something up because a lot of videos about this topic get it wrong. Margaret Hamilton did not work on Apollo 1. Apollo 1 never flew. It was a launchpad test in January 1967 that ended in a fire that killed 3 astronauts, a tragedy that changed the entire program before a single Apollo mission ever left the ground. Hamilton's work, the work this story is actually about, was on Apollo 11, the mission that put the first human footprints on the moon in July of 1969. And this isn't some deathbed confession or newly uncovered secret, either. Everything here comes from the public record. Mission transcripts anyone can read, the actual mission control audio you can still listen to online today, and decades of interviews Hamilton herself has given openly on stage, in print, on camera. The story was never hidden. It was just never told with software as the main character because in 1969, almost nobody thought the software was the interesting part. That's really where this begins, with what people paid attention to and what they didn't. When the world pictured the moon landing, it pictured the roar of the Saturn V, the gleaming hull of the command module, astronauts in bulky, white suits bouncing across the surface. Nobody pictured lines of code because most people didn't know there was code involved at all, let alone that it would matter as much as it did. The phrase software engineering barely existed as a serious job title. It was Margaret Hamilton, working at MIT, who helped push that phrase into existence because she believed the work her team was doing deserved the same respect as the engineers building the rocket itself. Hamilton wasn't a rocket scientist by training. She'd studied mathematics and philosophy at Earlham College, and before Apollo she'd written weather prediction software and code for military radar systems, the kind of work that teaches you, fast, what happens when a program breaks in the middle of something that actually matters. In 1964, she joined the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, the group NASA had trusted with an enormous and slightly terrifying job: build the onboard software that would fly astronauts to the moon and, more importantly, bring them back. By the time Apollo 11 was ready to fly, Hamilton was directing the team responsible for the flight software running inside both the command module and the lunar lander. To understand what she was up against, you have to picture the computer itself. The Apollo guidance computer had a tiny fraction of the memory of a modern calculator. Its permanent programming, the part that could never be changed once it left Earth, was physically woven by hand. Rows of women, many of them former textile workers, threaded copper wire through or around tiny magnetic rings, 1 wire per bit, in a process NASA nicknamed rope memory. Once that rope was woven, it was final. There was no patch, no software update, no way to fix a mistake once the spacecraft was on its way. Whatever Hamilton's team wrote had to work exactly right, the first time, with no do-overs, because there would be no second chance 250,000 miles from home. Most of the engineers around her were focused on hardware, and it's easy to understand why. Hardware is what you can see and touch, what roars and shakes and occasionally explodes on a test stand. Software had no smell of scorched metal, no visible danger. A lot of people at the time treated it almost as an afterthought, something finished up once the real engineering was done. Hamilton saw it the opposite way. She believed that in the most critical moments of the mission, it would be the software alone standing between the astronauts and disaster. And so she built her entire approach to the job around one guiding principle that a lot of her colleagues found excessive at the time: Don't design a program that assumes everything will go right. Design a program that assumes something eventually will go wrong. That philosophy wasn't abstract for her. It became personal because of something almost embarrassingly small. Hamilton would sometimes bring her young daughter, Lauren, into the lab with her on evenings and weekends because Apollo's deadlines didn't leave much room for a normal home life. One night, while Hamilton worked nearby, Lauren was playing at the console of the Command Module Simulator, the same machine astronauts trained on. Without understanding what she was doing, Lauren accidentally triggered a program called P01, a routine meant to run only before launch, while the spacecraft was still sitting on the pad. The simulator accepted the command anyway, and in doing so it wiped out the navigation data the simulated flight depended on. The pretend mission was, in effect, lost. To most people, that would have made a funny story to tell at dinner. Hamilton didn't find it funny. She saw a real gap in the software. If a small child pressing buttons at random could erase critical flight data, then so could an exhausted astronaut, hundreds of thousands of miles from home, reaching for the wrong key after days without proper sleep. She documented exactly how the mistake could happen during an actual mission and formally requested that a safeguard be added, so the same program couldn't be triggered by accident mid-flight. The request came back denied. The reasoning she heard was consistent. These are the best-trained pilots in the world, and professionals like that simply do not make careless keystrokes. The safeguard was never added, and the vulnerability stayed exactly where it was. Hamilton didn't forget about it. She just kept working, kept pushing for the same kind of protection wherever she had influence over the code, because in her experience, that will never happen was rarely a safe bet. She was proven right faster than anyone expected. On Christmas Eve of 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed mission to leave Earth's orbit and circle the moon, 3 astronauts, 250,000 miles from home, the farthest any human beings had ever traveled. Somewhere during that mission, Commander Jim Lovell, one of the most experienced and capable pilots in the program, made almost exactly the mistake Hamilton had warned about months earlier. Working through a routine sequence, he accidentally selected the same pre-launch program that Hamilton's daughter had triggered on the simulator, and the onboard computer, doing precisely what it was told, wiped the spacecraft's navigation reference. Suddenly, in lunar orbit, with no coastline or landmark of any kind below them, the crew had no reliable sense of their own orientation. There is no simple fix for that kind of problem in deep space. The crew had to fall back on the oldest method of navigation there is, sighting known stars through the spacecraft's optics, one at a time, and feeding those angles back into the computer so it could slowly rebuild its understanding of where the ship actually was. It worked. The crew stayed calm, the training held, and Apollo 8 came home safely. But it cost time, focus, and a level of tension nobody wanted to repeat, all because of the exact keystroke error Hamilton had flagged and been turned down on. When mission planners heard what had happened, the response was immediate. Build the safeguard, and build it now. The fix that had been dismissed as unnecessary a few months earlier suddenly became urgent the moment a veteran astronaut proved it could happen to anyone. That near-miss reshaped how Hamilton and her team approached the software for the mission everyone was already racing toward, an actual landing on the lunar surface, where there would be no time to sit and recite the stars if something went wrong. In the months leading up to Apollo 11, her team rebuilt core parts of the guidance software around a harder, more general lesson. It wasn't enough to patch one specific mistake. Sooner or later, in some form nobody could fully predict, the computer would be asked to do more than it had the capacity to handle in that instant. And when that happened, a typical computer of that era would simply lock up, trying to do everything at once and accomplishing nothing, which during a landing could be fatal. So Hamilton built something unusual for the time, software that could recognize when it was overloaded and respond intelligently instead of freezing. The system was designed to run tasks by priority rather than in a fixed order, constantly asking, in effect, which jobs actually matter right now for keeping the crew alive. Navigation, guidance, and control of the descent itself sat at the very top of that list, protected above everything else. If the computer ever found itself buried under more work than it could process, it wouldn't try to finish every task and fail at all of them. It would deliberately drop the lower priority work, clear itself, restart the essential functions, and keep flying without missing a beat. It was the same philosophy she'd been arguing for since the beginning, now built directly into the code that would fly 2 men down to the surface of another world, expect the unexpected, and build a system that survives it. She had no way of knowing exactly when that design would be tested. She only knew from experience that eventually it would be. The test came at almost the worst possible moment imaginable, inside the final minutes of the actual lunar descent, with the entire world watching. The lunar module Eagle, carrying Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, had separated from the command module and begun its long fall toward the surface. Everything was proceeding normally until, at roughly 33,000 feet, a program alarm lit up on the display. The number 1202. Aldrin read it out over the radio, and the question behind his voice was the one everyone in that spacecraft and everyone in Houston needed answered immediately. Could they keep going, or did they need to abort? In Houston, Flight Director Gene Kranz needed a call within seconds, because every second of hesitation meant hundreds more feet of lost altitude. He turned to his guidance officer, Steve Bales, who in turn was relying on a backroom engineer named Jack Garman. In the weeks before the flight, Garman had done something few others had bothered to do. He'd sat down and worked out, in advance, exactly what every possible alarm code meant and whether it was something the mission could survive. He recognized 1202 immediately as a computer overload alarm. It wasn't a sign that the computer had failed. It was the computer announcing in its own blunt way that it had detected it was being asked to do too much at once, and it was handling that overload exactly the way it had been designed to. As long as the alarms didn't become continuous, Garman said, they were fine to continue. The call went up the chain in seconds. Go for landing. The overload itself turned out to have a small, almost mundane cause. A switch controlling the spacecraft's rendezvous radar had been left in a position that fed the computer a stream of extra data it didn't need during descent, on top of everything else it was already managing: guidance, navigation, engine control, radar readings from the ground below. Faced with more input than it could process in real time, the computer did exactly what Hamilton's design told it to do. It discarded the unnecessary radar processing, protected the tasks that actually mattered for keeping the crew alive, and kept the landing sequence running without interruption. That wasn't the only tense moment in those final minutes. As the computer was managing its own overload, Armstrong looked out the window and realized the automated guidance was steering them toward a boulder-strewn crater, exactly the kind of terrain that could tip the lander over on touchdown. He took manual control, tilting the spacecraft forward, searching for smoother ground while the fuel gauge kept falling. In Houston, callouts came up marking the dwindling fuel supply: 60 seconds, then 30, the point past which the mission rules required an abort. Armstrong kept flying, kept searching, and with roughly 25 seconds of fuel remaining, the lander's sensors finally confirmed contact with the surface. The engine shut down, and the words came down that the whole world had been waiting to hear. The Eagle had landed. It's worth sitting with how close that really was. Almost nothing about that landing went exactly according to plan. The computer was overloaded. The intended landing site turned out to be dangerous. The fuel margin came down to a matter of seconds. And it worked anyway, not because everything went right, but because one engineer had spent years assuming things would go wrong and had built a system capable of handling it when they did. Margaret Hamilton went on to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016 for that work, and the fault-tolerant approach to software she pioneered on Apollo didn't stay confined to spaceflight. Those same principles now sit quietly inside aircraft autopilots, hospital monitoring equipment, and other systems where failure simply isn't an option. None of this was ever a secret. It's all sitting in mission transcripts and recorded audio loops that anyone can go listen to today. It just took a while for the story of the moon landing to make room for the part of it that never showed up on camera. So, here's the question worth sitting with. In a mission remembered as flawless, it was actually built to survive being imperfect. What does that tell you about how we usually tell the story of big achievements, and what else might be getting left out?